For many years, Hugh Jackman hasn't just been a star. He's been one of those rare Hollywood phenomena where talent, discipline, and resilience all come together in one person. He's known worldwide for playing Wolverine in the X-Men series, a role that spanned nearly 2 decades and turned him into an icon of the superhero genre with billions of dollars in global box office. Beyond film, Hugh Jackman also conquered Broadway, winning a prestigious Tony Award for The Boy from Oz and proving himself a truly versatile artist like few others. He hosted the Oscars in 2009, earned an Oscar nomination for his role in Les Miserables, and won a Golden Globe for that same performance. On top of that, he's received major honors like an Emmy and a Grammy, making him one of the very few entertainers to achieve EGOT-level success across multiple fields, from small stages in Australia to the biggest arenas in Hollywood. Hugh Jackman has built what many call a flawless career, a journey where every step has been marked by recognition and admiration from audiences and critics alike. But behind those dazzling achievements lies another story, one that's never told on the red carpet or under stage lights. Few people know that behind the image of that strong man is someone who grew up with the fear of abandonment, a childhood wound that never fully healed. When his mother left the family, he was just a little kid, and from that moment on, he learned to be strong, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. For years, he tried to become the best version of himself, not just to succeed, but to be loved and accepted. Yet, even at the peak of success, life kept testing him, from repeated skin cancer treatments to the end of a marriage that lasted nearly 3 decades. And then, at 57, just when everything seemed settled, he faced that familiar loneliness once again. But what makes Hugh Jackman's story truly special isn't the pain he's endured, it's how he keeps standing after it all, still working, still giving, still smiling, as if there are no cracks inside him at all. Because sometimes willpower isn't about never falling. It's about keeping walking, even when you're already broken inside. If this story makes you feel the things the spotlight can't hide, please hit subscribe so we can keep exploring the real journeys behind the legends. And if the previous part was the story of a man the world thought they understood, this part is where everything truly begins. Not on stage, not under the lights, but on an ordinary morning no one could have guessed would become the deepest cut in Hugh Jackman's life. He was only 8 years old then, a child who still believed family was something that would never disappear, that the people he loved would always be there when he woke up. But that morning shattered everything. There was no big fight, no long goodbye, no explanation clear enough for a child to understand what was happening. Just a quiet change: his mother left, and she never came back. No real final hug, no promise that things would be okay. Nothing to hold on to. Just an emptiness. An emptiness. An emptiness an 8-year-old couldn't name, but could feel so clearly. In the days that followed, Hugh didn't cry loudly like people might expect. He waited. He waited the way a child believes everything is only temporary. He waited for his mom to come back, for an explanation, for someone to say it was all a misunderstanding. But time passed, and nothing happened. No one came back. No one explained. And in that silence, a thought began to form, a dangerous thought that didn't even need words to exist. Maybe it's because of me. That's how a child makes sense of things it can't understand. Not because the world is complicated, but because it's too simple. If someone leaves, there has to be a reason. And if no one says what the reason is, the child will make one up. And that reason, almost always, is themselves. There's something wrong with me. There's something not good enough to make people stay. That thought didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in quietly, like a tiny crack in a wall, at first unnoticed. But over time it spread wider, deeper, until the whole structure started to wobble. Hugh grew up, but that feeling never went away. It didn't need to be repeated to survive. It just stayed there, in how he saw himself, in how he loved others, in how he always tried to be the best version of himself. Not because he wanted perfection, but because he was afraid that if he wasn't good enough, people would leave again. And the most painful part isn't that his mother left that morning. It's that a part of him stayed in that morning. Forever a child, still waiting, still wondering what he did wrong, still trying to be good enough so he won't be abandoned again. And, from that moment, Hugh Jackman's life stopped being just a journey toward success and became a quiet, lifelong effort to heal a wound he didn't even know how to name. And then, when that morning ended, life didn't pause to let a child figure out what had just happened. It kept moving, cold and steady, carrying Hugh Jackman into a new phase where the pain had no name, was never mentioned, and wasn't even allowed to exist. He lived with his father, a man strong in the way of his generation, disciplined, responsible, but almost never talking about feelings. In that house, there were no long talks about hurt, no questions like, "Are you okay?" and certainly no explanations for his mother's absence. Everything was simply ignored, as if not talking about it would make it disappear. But the pain didn't disappear. It just learned to hide. And so did Hugh. No one taught him how to face loss, so he learned to adapt. No one taught him how to cry, so he learned to stay silent. Day by day, he became stable in exactly the way adults wanted: going to school, behaving properly, causing no trouble. But that stability wasn't healing. It was just a shell built to keep everything looking normal, even when everything inside was breaking apart. Hugh began to understand that his feelings had no place in this world, that if he wanted to be accepted, he had to control them, had to keep everything inside, and so he did perfectly enough that no one noticed. He learned to smile when he wasn't okay, learned to say, "I'm fine," even when he didn't understand what he was feeling, learned to become what others needed instead of being himself. And over time, it stopped being a choice, it became instinct, a survival mechanism. The older he got, the better he got at hiding. He became strong, reliable, the person everyone could count on. But what was the cost of that strength? It was slowly losing touch with his own emotions. Unspoken sadness didn't vanish, it piled up. Unanswered questions didn't fade, they repeated. And an emptiness began to form, not loud, not obvious, but always there. There were evenings when everything got quiet, when no one was around for him to be stable for, and Hugh still felt something he could hardly name: a sense of absence, as if a part of him had been taken away long ago and never returned. But instead of facing it, he did what he'd learned as a kid. Keep going, keep busy, keep fulfilling his role, because stopping meant feeling. And feeling was something he'd never really learned how to do. Gradually, the person Hugh became started to have two clear layers. On the outside was a strong, positive, always energetic man, a role model anyone could admire. But inside was a child, still silent, still trying to figure out why he wasn't enough to make someone stay. And the scariest part wasn't that he felt lonely, it was that he'd gotten used to it. Loneliness was no longer a temporary state, it became the foundation, something always there, whether he was in a crowd or standing alone. And in a way, that very silence taught him how to survive. It taught him how to endure, how to adapt, how to look okay in other people's eyes. But it also took something very important from him: the real ability to feel and be understood. Because when someone spends too much time hiding their emotions, eventually they don't just hide them from others, they hide them from themselves. And that's how Hugh Jackman grew up. Not by healing his wound, but by learning to live with it, in silence, in discipline, and in a loneliness no one could see. And then, from that silence, Hugh Jackman didn't just learn to hide his emotions. He began learning how to become the person he thought the world would never leave. If the greatest pain, for a child is feeling not enough, then the natural response is to try to become enough in every possible way. Hugh became the good kid, not in the carefree way of a child, but in the calculated way of a wounded soul. He was obedient, hard-working, well-behaved, always trying to meet every expectation. He didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to disappoint anyone, because deep down he believed that if he messed up, if he wasn't good enough, people would leave again. The older he got, the stronger that need to please others became. Hugh learned to read people's eyes, to read their emotions, to adjust himself to fit what they needed. If someone needed cheerful, he'd be cheerful. If someone needed strong, he'd be strong. If someone needed perfect, he'd try to be that. But in the process, something gradually disappeared. His real self. Not because he didn't have it, but because he no longer believed it was enough to be loved. And then, one day, Hugh found the stage. At first, it was just an opportunity, activity, an experience. But very quickly it became something much bigger. On stage, for the first time in his life, he was seen. Not as a kid trying hard, but as someone shining. Every round of applause, every pair of eyes following him, every compliment. They all created a feeling he'd never had before, being recognized. And that was almost addictive, because in a world where he always felt he wasn't enough, the stage was the only place telling him he had value. But right there, a dangerous belief began to take root. That love isn't something given naturally. It has to be earned. Through effort, through perfection, through becoming the best version others want to see. Hugh didn't just perform on stage. He started carrying that into his life. He performed to be accepted. He performed to be loved. And gradually, the line between his real self and the role blurred. He was no longer just someone trying, he became someone who wasn't allowed to fail. Because failure wasn't just failure. In his mind, it meant not being good enough. And not good enough meant possibly being left behind. The obsession with perfection didn't come from ambition. It came from fear. Fear that if he wasn't perfect, he'd lose what he had. Fear that if he didn't keep pleasing everyone, they'd leave, just like his mother had. And so Hugh kept trying, relentlessly. He worked harder, behaved better, perfected himself more. He became the person everyone loved, everyone admired. But beneath it all was a truth few noticed. He wasn't doing all this because he wanted to be great. He was doing it because he was afraid of not being loved. The most painful part was that even when he received love, he still didn't truly believe in it. Because if love has to be earned, it can also be lost. And if it can be lost, it's never truly safe. Hugh could stand on stage, hear thousands applauding, receive admiration from the whole world. But a part of him was still that 8-year-old kid wondering, will they stay if I'm not perfect anymore? And that question followed him his whole life. It drove him forward, helped him achieve things most people couldn't. But at the same time, it kept him in an endless loop trying, getting recognized, then doubting, then trying even harder. A loop with no end, because it didn't come from ambition, but from a wound that was never truly healed. And then, once the belief that love must be earned had taken deep enough root, Hugh Jackman no longer just stood on stage like a child, seeking recognition. He began pursuing it seriously, systematically, as if it were the only path to becoming enough. He entered professional acting training, learning every technique, every movement, every way to control his voice and body, not just to become a good actor, but to control something he'd never truly controlled: his life. In a world where his childhood was full of uncertainties, where someone could leave without any explanation, the stage offered something very different: order. There, everything had a script, every emotion had a reason, every ending was predetermined, and for the first time, Hugh felt he had control over the story. When he stepped onto the stage, something strange happened. He was no longer himself. He became someone else. someone who didn't carry the fear of abandonment, someone who didn't doubt his own worth, someone who was loved, seen, applauded without having to wonder why. In those moments, he didn't have to try to be enough. He already was, just by existing in the role. And that feeling made him come back, time after time, not because he loved the stage, but because it was the only place he wasn't the child who'd been left behind. But everything has two sides. Because the stage only lasts for a limited time, the lights eventually go out. The audience eventually leaves. And when Hugh stepped down, when the makeup came off, when no one was looking at him with admiring eyes anymore, reality returned, quietly but unavoidably. And with it, the emptiness came back, even more clearly than before. Because now he knew what feeling enough was like, and the contrast made everything hurt more. There were nights, after a show ended, when the applause still rang in his ears. Hugh would go back to his room and feel nothing, not sadness in an obvious way, but a hard-to-name void, as if everything he just experienced didn't really belong to him. He began to realize that the moments he felt most alive were the ones when he wasn't himself. And that, in a way, was scarier than anything. Gradually, acting stopped being just a job or a passion. It became a refuge, a place he could run to whenever reality got too heavy, a place he could temporarily escape the unanswered questions, the feeling of not being enough, the fear of abandonment. But, like any refuge, it wasn't a long-term solution. It didn't heal the wound. It just helped him forget for a while. And when the forgetting wore off, everything was still there, waiting for him to return. And right in that process, a separation began to form. Not loud, not obvious, but increasingly deep. There was Hugh Jackman on stage, confident, captivating, full of energy, the person everyone wanted to be. And then there was Hugh Jackman off stage, quieter, more reserved, carrying thoughts he never spoke aloud. Two people existing side by side, but never truly meeting. One loved by the world, the other still trying to understand why he'd never felt enough. And the most dangerous thing wasn't that he had two selves. It was that he began to believe only one of them deserved love, the one on stage. The perfect one, the one without cracks. The other one, the real one, was the one who needed fixing, hiding, controlling. And so Hugh kept performing, not just on stage, but in his entire life. He performed to be accepted. He performed to keep everything from falling apart. He performed to hide a truth even he didn't want to face that. No matter how many roles, how many applauses, how many successes, the child inside him had never truly left that morning. And then, as the boundary between his real self and the roles grew blurrier, an opportunity appeared, one that not only changed Hugh Jackman's career, but redefined his entire identity in the eyes of the world. The role of Wolverine came to him as a turning point, but no one, not even he, could have guessed the price it would carry. From a stage actor with deep inner life, he stepped into a completely different persona, a warrior, a survivor, an icon of raw strength. And in a short time, Wolverine didn't just become a role. It became his identity. The first X-Men movie succeeded beyond expectations, ushering in a new era for superhero films and turning Hugh Jackman from a relatively unknown name into a global face. Audiences didn't just see him. They believed in him. Believed he was Wolverine. And when a role becomes too big, too iconic, it starts to swallow everything around it, including the person behind it. Hugh understood that to maintain that image, he didn't just need to act well, he had to become it, physically and mentally. And so a transformation began. Not the usual change for a role, but an extreme process that stretched over many years. He trained at near unimaginable intensity, pushing his body to the limits of strength and endurance. Strict diets, hours-long workouts, brutal weight gain and weight cut cycles all became part of daily life. There were periods when he had to keep his body in constant stress, not just to look strong, but to sustain the image the world expected. And gradually, his body stopped being just it, became a tool, a symbol, something he had to serve. But the pressure wasn't just physical. Wolverine isn't a gentle character. He's a man full of trauma, anger, and survival instinct. And to portray that convincingly, Hugh had to tap into the deepest parts of himself, the parts he'd spent his whole life hiding. Every time he stepped into the role, he wasn't just acting, he was mining. Mining the pain, mining the loneliness, mining the sense of abandonment he'd carried since he was a child. And when a role requires you to constantly touch unhealed wounds, it stops being work. It becomes a form of self-erasure. The world saw a strong, muscular, energetic Hugh Jackman, a true alpha male. A man who never fell, never showed weakness. But inside, the story was completely different. His body started to tire, injuries piled up. The pain didn't go away after a few days of rest. And his mind was the same, burned out in a way no one could see. Because when you spend too much time becoming someone else, you start to lose touch with who you really are. The more successful he became, the greater the pressure grew. Each new film wasn't just a project. It was a promise. A promise that he would continue to be Wolverine, continue to be strong, continue to stay the same. Audiences didn't want to see him age. They didn't want to see him weaken. They didn't want to see any cracks in the image they loved. And Hugh, who had always tried to please others, kept delivering. He went back to the gym. He pushed himself one more time. He kept upholding that image, even as the cost grew higher and higher. But there was one thing no one ever said out loud, that being locked into an archetype, no matter how grand, is a form of imprisonment. Hugh was no longer just an actor who could experiment, who could fail, who could change. He became Wolverine, and any attempt to break out of that image carried risk of losing acceptance, risk of no longer being loved the way he had been. And for someone who grew up with the fear of abandonment, that wasn't just a professional risk, it was a deep, personal terror. So he kept going, year after year, film after film, success after success, fame growing bigger, but along with it came a heavier and heavier feeling that he was paying a price for the very thing that had brought him to the top. Wolverine wasn't just the role that made Hugh Jackman. It was the role that took so much from him. And at some point, success stopped being a reward. It became a burden he didn't know how to put down. And then, as success began turning into more of a burden than a reward, Hugh Jackman's life gradually split into two parallel worlds, two versions of himself existing at the same time, but never truly touching each other. By day, he was Wolverine, a blockbuster action superstar, an icon of strength, discipline, and invincibility, a man the whole world looked at with admiration, a near-perfect model of masculinity and control. Every move he made was watched. Every role came with expectations, and every appearance had to maintain a flawless image. But when the set lights went out, when the cut calls stopped echoing, another person emerged. A completely different Hugh Jackman, quieter, softer, and far more vulnerable than the world had ever seen. On Broadway stages, he didn't have to be a warrior. He was allowed to sing, allowed to cry, allowed to express emotions Wolverine could never have. There, he didn't have to uphold the alpha male image. He could be an artist, a human being, alive through feelings, through connection with the audience, through the truest parts of his soul. And in those moments, Hugh felt something very close to liberation, as if he could finally breathe, finally exist without tensing up. But that liberation never lasted long, because those two worlds could never merge into one. The problem wasn't that he couldn't do both, it was that he couldn't be himself in both at the same time. The film world wanted him strong, cold, flawless. The stage allowed him to be weak, emotional, and real. And caught between those two opposites, Hugh was stretched like a taut wire, each side demanding a different version of him, and he tried to meet both, because that's what he'd learned since childhood: become what others need. But the more he did that, the more he felt he was losing something vitally important: his sense of who he really was. The pressure to maintain a flawless image didn't just come from work, it came from himself. Hugh didn't allow himself to fail, didn't allow himself to be weak, didn't allow himself to stop, because if he stopped, if he was no longer the person everyone expected, what would happen? Would they still stay? Would they still love him? And that question, the one that started when he was 8 years old, had never truly left him. The more successful he became, the wider the gap grew between those two selves. Hugh Jackman on screen became more and more perfect, more and more powerful, more and more distant from anything fragile and human. But the Hugh Jackman inside, the one without a script, without lights, without applause, grew more and more exhausted. He began to feel like he was living two lives, but truly belonging to neither. One life loved by the entire world, and one life even he didn't know how to understand. Identity conflict didn't arrive like a shock. It came slowly, quietly, building up over years, over roles, over every time he had to become someone else to be accepted. And then at some point, the question stopped being "who am I" in the role and became "who am I" when there are no more roles? And that was a question he had never truly prepared to answer. The most painful thing wasn't that Hugh had to live two lives. It was that he wasn't sure which one was real. When he stood on a Broadway stage, he felt more authentic than ever. But it was still a role. When he stood in front of the camera with a perfect body and a steely gaze, he looked like an icon. But that wasn't his true self either. And between those two images, the real Hugh Jackman seemed trapped, with no space to exist. And so he kept going, kept playing roles, kept pleasing, kept holding everything in perfect shape. But deep inside, one question grew louder: not whether he would succeed, but whether he was still himself. And sometimes, in those rare moments when no one was watching, when there were no roles to cling to, Hugh could feel it very clearly, that the farther he went, the more he lost the person he had tried to become from the beginning. And then, as the question, "who am I without a role?" began to grow louder in the silence, Hugh Jackman met someone who made him believe that maybe, for the first time in his life, he didn't have to perform anymore. Deborah Lee Furness. Their meeting wasn't like a glamorous Hollywood romance. It wasn't two shining stars crashing together under flashbulbs. It was a very real, very human connection. A sense of peace Hugh had never experienced before. Deborah didn't see him as a role, didn't see him as a rising icon. She saw him as a person, and for someone who had spent his whole life trying to become what others wanted, that felt almost like a miracle. With her, Hugh didn't have to prove he was good enough, didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to become Wolverine or any image the world expected. He just had to be himself, or, at least, the closest version to his true self he could reach. And that feeling was safe, not the fake safety of stage lights, but a deep inner quiet, where he no longer had to fear someone would leave if he wasn't enough. In Deborah, Hugh found what he'd been missing since he was a child: an emotional anchor, a place to come home to, someone who stayed. They got married, and that marriage quickly became one of Hollywood's most admired love stories, not because of outward perfection, but because of its rare durability in a world full of change. For Hugh, marriage wasn't just love, it was a refuge, a place where he could set aside every role, every pressure, every expectation, a place where he believed he had finally found what he'd always been searching for: stability. Then they built a family together. Not the easy way, but through meaningful choices. Hugh and Deborah adopted children, two kids who became the center of their lives, giving him a new role: father. And in that role, Hugh seemed to find another kind of healing. He loved his children the way he once wished he'd been loved fully, unconditionally. He was there, present, caring, protective, as if by being a good father, he could repair what had happened to him. For many years, Hugh truly believed he had overcome his past, that the wound from that morning when he was 8 years old had finally been mended. He had a loving wife, a solid family, a thriving career, everything a person needs to feel enough. And from the outside looking in, it seemed true. He smiled more, lived more positively, became a model of a man who was both successful and happy. But there was one thing Hugh never truly realized: that healing isn't about building a newer, prettier life to cover up an old wound. The wound was still there. It was just covered by love, by responsibility, by all the good things he had created. It didn't disappear. It just stayed quiet. And like everything Hugh had learned since childhood, things that are buried don't vanish. They wait. They were very small, very hard to notice moments, times. He felt uneasy for no clear reason. Times he wondered if everything was really solid. Times a vague fear appeared, and then vanished quickly. But Hugh didn't stop to listen to those signals. He kept living, kept loving, kept believing he was okay. Because if he stopped, if he looked too deeply, he might have to face a truth he wasn't ready to accept: that, even though he had built a life many people dream of, the child inside him had never truly believed things wouldn't disappear. And perhaps that's the most tragic part of this story. Not that Hugh Jackman didn't have love, not that he didn't have a family, but that deep in his soul, he never fully believed that love was permanent, that it didn't have to be earned every day, that it wouldn't leave. And so, even though he had found a refuge, a part of him still stood at the door, always ready for the possibility that one day he might have to step out alone again. And it was from the place he once believed was the safest that the cracks began to appear. Not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly and almost imperceptibly, just like the way Hugh Jackman had learned to bury his emotions since he was a child. Life kept getting busier, even busier than ever before. Big projects, new roles, constant travel between countries, between film sets and stages, between Hollywood and Broadway. On the surface, it was the peak of a career. But inside, it created a distance, not geographical, but emotional. Hugh was still there, still present in his roles as a husband and a father. But a part of him was always somewhere else. In the work, in the pressure, in the expectations he couldn't let go of. It wasn't that he didn't love his family. On the contrary, he probably loved them in the most intense way he knew how. But love isn't always enough to keep everything intact, especially when it's not expressed in the way the other person needs. Silences started to appear, shorter conversations, fewer looks, moments when both were in the same room but not really with each other. There were no big fights, no clear, hurtful words, just silence. And as Hugh had learned very early on, silence can be the most dangerous thing. Deborah Lee Furness was still there, still the person who had once given him a sense of safety, still the one who had built a family with him, still the one who understood him more than anyone else. But gradually the connection between them began to change, not because they didn't try, but because there were things left unsaid. And when those things piled up long enough, they created a gap no one knew where to start filling. Hugh, who always tried to keep everything okay, kept doing what he'd done his whole life, staying silent, pushing forward, not directly confronting what was cracking. They were both still there, still appearing together in public, still sharing family moments, still maintaining the image of a solid couple the world admired. But behind those images, something had changed. Not an immediate shattering, but a gradual erosion. Small things left unresolved, emotions left unnamed, needs left unmet. And over time, all of it built into a feeling of distance, a feeling that even the people involved found hard to explain. Perhaps the most painful part was that no one realized how serious it was until it had gone too far. Because there was no single clear moment when everything collapsed, no specific day they could point to and say, "This is when it ended." Instead, it was a process, a string of ordinary days, ordinary conversations, small decisions, all leading to an outcome no one was really prepared for. Hugh, who had spent his entire life pleasing others, keeping everything perfect, not disappointing anyone, found himself in a situation he couldn't fix with effort, and that touched a very deep fear that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, some things couldn't be held on to. And that feeling was painfully familiar. The signs of cracks were still hidden, not just from the world, but sometimes from themselves, because admitting that things were changing meant facing a truth no one wanted to accept, that the refuge they had built might no longer be as safe as before. And for Hugh, who had placed so much hope in finding stability in love, it wasn't just a marriage issue, it was the shaking of an entire belief. And then, as with everything that begins in silence, the breakdown also began there. Not with a big explosion, but with an ever-widening void. A void no one knew how to fill. A void that ultimately, no matter how hard they tried, became an uncrossable boundary. And in that silence, a love story once seen as Hollywood's most enduring began heading toward its end. Not because of a lack of love, but because there were cracks that love, if not nurtured and listened to, couldn't heal on its own. And while the cracks in his personal life began spreading quietly, another front was silently crumbling, not in his heart, but in Hugh Jackman's very body. For many years, he had lived as if his body were a machine that could endure anything: brutal training hours, extreme diets, constant weight gain, and weight loss cycles to serve the role, especially Wolverine. He pushed himself to be stronger, faster, more resilient, as if with enough discipline and determination, limits wouldn't exist. But the human body doesn't forget. It remembers everything, and at some point, it starts to respond. The first signs didn't come as a big shock. They came small, scattered, easy to overlook: a suspicious spot on the skin, a medical checkup, an unexpected diagnosis, skin cancer, then treatment, then recovery. And then it came back, not just once, multiple times. Each time wasn't just a health issue, it was a reminder. A reminder that his body wasn't invincible, that no matter how disciplined or strong he was, some things were beyond control. Meanwhile, the pressure from work never let up. Roles still demanded he maintain peak physical condition, still required him to transform his body as if he were still in his 20s. Hugh kept training, kept pushing himself to the limit, kept holding the image the world was used to. But inside, everything had changed. The pain didn't fade quickly anymore. Recovery wasn't easy anymore. His body began to slow down, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't just try harder to get past it. There were mornings when he woke up feeling tired in a way he couldn't explain, not from lack of sleep, not from too much work, but a deep inner exhaustion, as if his body was saying it had endured enough. But Hugh, accustomed to not listening to inner signals, kept moving forward. He kept working, kept performing, kept smiling. But this time the fatigue couldn't be completely hidden. It showed in the way he moved, in the pauses between sentences, in the moments when he no longer had the energy to maintain a perfect image. And then a realization began to form, slowly but unavoidably, that his body wasn't immortal. That time was passing, and it was leaving marks, not just on his face, but in every joint, every muscle, every cell. And for someone who had built his identity around strength, control, and discipline, that wasn't just scary, it was a crisis. Because if he could no longer do what he once did, then who was he? If he was no longer Wolverine, no longer the icon of strength, what was left? And that question wasn't just professional. It reached the very root of who he was, where his sense of self-worth had always been tied to what he could achieve, who he could become in others' eyes. The fear of aging didn't come from getting older. It came from loss. Loss of ability, loss of image, loss of acceptance. And for Hugh, who had spent his life trying to keep everything unchanged, it was something almost unacceptable. But this time, he couldn't control it, couldn't train his way through it, couldn't act his way around it. His body was saying something very clearly, that there are limits no one can overcome forever. And for the first time, Hugh was forced to listen, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. And in that silence, between treatments, between exhausting days, between moments when he was no longer the strongest man in the room, a truth began to emerge, that perhaps real strength isn't in constantly pushing against everything, but in accepting that you can be vulnerable too. But that was a lesson Hugh Jackman had never been taught. And now, at a time when everything else in his life was also shaking, he had to learn it the hardest way, not on stage, not in a role, but in his own body, where there was no script to cling to, and no character to hide the truth behind. And then, when his body began speaking in a way he could no longer ignore, when limits stopped being a distant concept and became everyday reality, another event hit, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to shake everything Hugh Jackman had built over nearly 3 decades. In 2023, the announcement of his divorce from Deborah Lee Furness was made. No scandal, no public accusations, no explosive collapse the press usually craves, just a brief, polite, almost clinical statement that after 27 years together, they had decided to part ways with respect and gratitude. But sometimes, the things left unsaid are the most painful ones. To the world, it was an amicable split, a rare example of two mature people ending a long relationship without public hurt. But for Hugh, it wasn't just an announcement. It was an ending of everything he had once believed was stable, enduring, the refuge he had spent his whole life building. And what made it heavier than anything else was the silence. There was no single moment he could blame, no clear event he could point to and say, "This is why." Just a long, quiet process, like cracks that had appeared long ago and finally could no longer be held together. And when it all ended, it didn't bring relief. It brought a void so familiar, it was terrifying. Because that feeling, Hugh had experienced it before. Not at 50, but at 8 years old, when someone he loved left without any explanation. When a bond that seemed unbreakable suddenly vanished, when he stood there, not understanding what had happened, only knowing that a part of his world was no longer there. And now, after nearly 30 years, that feeling returned. Not exactly the same, but close enough to awaken everything he had tried so hard to bury. The fear of abandonment isn't something that disappears with time. It just waits. And when something similar happens, it comes back with all the weight of the past. Hugh didn't just lose a marriage, he was facing that child inside him again. The child who once asked, "What did I do wrong?" And even though he had grown up, achieved success, become a man millions admired, that question never fully went away. It just changed its form. Perhaps he didn't say it out loud. Perhaps he didn't let himself think about it for too long. But in the quiet moments, when there were no roles to cling to, when there was no busy schedule to distract him, that feeling emerged that even after doing everything he could, there were still things he couldn't hold on to. And that touched a very deep pain, not because he failed at marriage, but because it made him feel like history was repeating itself. 27 years, not just a number. It was an entire life, memories, habits, moments no one else could understand. A person who had been there for the most important times in his life. And now, all of that didn't disappear, but it changed from present to past. And that transition is never easy, no matter how peacefully it happens. Hugh didn't collapse in public. He didn't let the world see his breakdown. He kept appearing, kept working, kept holding the image of a man in control of everything. But inside, there were things no one could see. Quieter mornings, bigger rooms. Moments when he realized the person he once shared everything with was no longer there. And perhaps the most painful thing wasn't losing a relationship, but realizing that everything he had built to feel safe could vanish, that no matter how hard he tried, how much he loved, how much he gave, there were still things beyond control. And for someone who had spent his whole life controlling himself, that was a very hard truth to accept. Some people go through a breakup and see it as a new beginning, but for Hugh at that point, it felt more like a repetition than a renewal. A circle closing, bringing him back to where it all started, with a familiar but no less painful feeling. A feeling he had spent his entire life trying to escape, but ultimately had to face. And amid all the success, the awards, the rounds of applause, there was one very private moment. No one witnessed it. No one recorded it. When Hugh Jackman had to confront a simple but heavy truth that after everything, after 27 years, after every effort to build a life different from the past, he was standing alone once again, not as a star, not as an icon, but as a human being. A human being who had loved, who had believed, who had hoped, and now had to learn to accept that some stories don't end the way we want them to. And in the silence of that moment, with no applause, no lights, no role to hide behind, all that remained was a very real, very raw feeling he was alone again. And when it was all over, when the announcements had been made, when the world kept turning as if nothing had changed, for Hugh Jackman, a completely different phase began, a phase. Without the noise of work, without the shield of roles, and without the role he had held for nearly 3 decades, husband. Life after divorce didn't arrive like a storm, but like a prolonged silence. No loud arguments, no emotional explosions, just a quiet but complete shift, a different rhythm, a different space, a reality he had to get used to from scratch. There was no longer the role of ideal husband to step into every day. No longer someone by his side to share the smallest things. No longer the feeling that there was a fixed place he belonged to. And for someone who had spent his whole life searching for stability, that wasn't just a change, it was a void that couldn't be filled with work, with fame, or with any role. The days passed more slowly. The evenings stretched longer. Moments that used to be filled by someone else's presence now became uncomfortably quiet. And in that quiet, Hugh began to feel more clearly than ever something he had avoided his entire life. The emptiness when the lights go out, when no one was watching, no one expecting, no one for him to become a better version for. He was left with himself. And that was a place he had never truly been familiar with. There were moments he asked himself, not to the press, not to the audience, but to himself. Who am I? Not Hugh Jackman the movie star, not Wolverine, not the Broadway artist, not the husband, the family man, but the person behind all of that. And that question wasn't easy to answer, because for so many years he had defined himself through roles, what he did, what he gave to others. But when those roles gradually faded, what remained wasn't always clear. Loneliness was no longer a fleeting feeling. It became present, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Not loneliness in a crowd, but loneliness in his own space, when there was no one to talk to, no one to share with, no one to fill the silences. And this time, there was no role to hide it, no stage to step onto and become someone else, no lights to blur what he was feeling. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, Hugh was forced to face himself without any armor, not the perfect version, not the strong one, not the one always in control, but a human being with unanswered questions, with unhealed wounds, with fears he had carried for so long. This didn't happen in a single moment. It came slowly, day by day, through every silence, every time he realized nothing external could help him escape anymore. And in that process, a truth began to emerge, that his whole life he had been running. Not from success, but from himself. He ran into work, into roles, into relationships, into things that could give him the feeling he was enough, that he was okay. But now, as all of that receded, he had nowhere left to run, and that was both the scariest thing and the most necessary. Because only when there was nothing left to hold on to could a person begin to see themselves clearly, not through others' lenses, not through roles, but through the truth. A truth that might not be perfect, might not be comfortable, but was real. Hugh Jackman was no longer the person the world thought they understood. And in the silence after everything, he also began to realize that perhaps he had never truly understood himself either. But this time, instead of continuing to run, instead of continuing to perform, he stopped. Quietly. No lights. No applause. Just him and the person he had to learn to face for the first time in his life. And then, in the silence he could no longer escape, when all the roles had fallen away and the questions were no longer drowned out by the noise of life, Hugh Jackman began to realize that even though many things had ended, not everything was gone. Some things were still there. Not grand, not loud, but real enough to hold him when everything else seemed to slip from his grasp. And among them, the most important, was his role as a father. If there was one place where Hugh didn't need to be perfect, it was when he was with his children. No audience, no expectation to be a role model, no pressure to maintain an image, just very simple moments. Small conversations, meals, laughter that didn't have to be forced. And in those moments, he wasn't Wolverine, wasn't a star, wasn't the man the world expected. He was just a dad, and that, in some way, was enough. The love he gave his children was unlike anything he had experienced before. It wasn't something that had to be earned, wasn't conditional. It existed naturally, without needing proof, and that made it different. When Hugh looked at his kids, he didn't see expectations, didn't see standards he had to meet. He just saw people who needed love, protection, presence, and in giving that love, he began to touch something he had been searching for a very long time, a sense of connection. Not based on perfection. There were days, very small moments, but carrying more meaning than any role he had ever played. A simple word. A hug. A quiet afternoon when nothing special happened. But those ordinary things kept him anchored to reality, pulled him out of the looping thoughts about the past, about what was lost. They didn't erase the pain, but they made it more bearable, easier to carry. Gradually, Hugh began to let go of something he had held on to his entire life, the need to be perfect, not because he stopped caring, but because he started to understand that perfection wasn't what kept things from leaving. He had tried to become the best, strongest, most reliable version of himself, but things still left, and that made him realize that perhaps the problem wasn't that he wasn't perfect enough, but that he had placed too much faith in something that doesn't really exist. Instead, he began to accept imperfection, accepting that some parts of life can't be fixed, accepting that some stories don't end the way we want, and more importantly, accepting that he himself didn't need to be perfect to deserve love. This wasn't a big, sudden change. It happened slowly, through every experience, every moment, every time he chose to stay with his emotions instead of running from them. Hope, for Hugh at this point, was no longer something grand. It wasn't about everything going back to the way it was, or him regaining everything he had lost. It was smaller, more fragile, but also more real. It lay in the fact that he could still wake up every day and keep going, still love, still be present, still find meaning in simple things, and perhaps, For the first time in his life, Hugh stopped trying to become someone else to feel enough. He began learning how to stay with himself. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And in that truth, even with so many cracks still there, something was slowly taking shape. Not complete healing, but the ability to keep living with what he carried, not by hiding it, but by accepting it. And sometimes just that is already a form of victory. And then, from those small but genuine moments, Hugh Jackman gradually moved towards something he had avoided his entire life: the truth. Not the truth the world saw, not the image built over decades on screen and stage, but the truth inside him, a truth that wasn't perfect, wasn't neat, and wasn't easy to accept. For a very long time, Hugh had lived with the belief that if he was good enough, strong enough, perfect enough, everything would be okay, that he could control his life, avoid losses, hold on to what mattered. But now, after everything that had happened, he could no longer believe that. For the first time, Hugh began to admit, not to the press, not to the audience, but to himself, that he wasn't perfect, and that wasn't a failure. It was just a truth he had tried to hide with discipline, with success, with becoming the best version of himself in others' eyes. But no matter how hard he tried, there were parts of him that couldn't be fixed by perfection. The wounds from the past, the deep fears, the questions that never got answers, they didn't vanish just because he became more successful. He also began to understand that the past couldn't be gone back to and changed. There was no way to return to that morning when he was 8 and make things different. No way to relive the years that had passed and make them more perfect. And most importantly, no way to go back to the person he once was before everything changed, before the cracks appeared. Some doors, once closed, don't open again. And accepting that isn't weakness, it's a necessary step. But acceptance doesn't mean it's easy, because when you stop trying to fix the past, you're forced to learn how to live with what it left behind. And for Hugh, that meant living with his wounds, not by hiding them, but by recognizing that they are part of who he is. Not the whole of him, but an inseparable part. For many years, he had tried to build the image of the perfect man, the man everyone admired. A man who made no mistakes, never fell, never showed weakness. But now, that image was starting to feel too heavy to carry. Not because he couldn't keep holding it, but because he no longer wanted to live that way. Because behind that perfection was a truth he could no longer deny: that it wasn't really him. Letting go of that image wasn't a big decision. It was a process in which Hugh began to allow himself to be a little more vulnerable, a little more real, a little more imperfect. He stopped trying to hide every crack, stopped forcing himself to always be strong, and that, in a way, was terrifying. Because when you let go of the shell that has protected you your whole life, you don't know what comes next. But at the same time, it brought a different feeling, a relief he had never experienced before. Not because all the problems were solved, but because he no longer had to pretend they didn't exist. Hugh began to accept his real self, a human being with both strength and weakness, with both success and failure, with things he was proud of and things he was still learning to understand. And perhaps that's the hardest thing a person can do: not achieving success, but accepting themselves when all the layers have been stripped away, not becoming who the world wants, but becoming who they truly are. Hugh Jackman was no longer the perfect image people once believed in, and he no longer needed to be, because in that imperfection, in the cracks he once tried to hide, there was something truer, deeper, and perhaps more worthy of love. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to become someone else. He was simply himself, with everything he had been through, everything he had lost, and everything he was still learning to accept. And after everything that had happened, the years of running, the roles that hit him, The relationships that once were refuges and then gradually cracked the story of Hugh Jackman didn't end with a triumphant victory, nor did it close with complete healing. It ended in a truer, quieter, and perhaps more painful way. Because if you look back at the entire journey from an 8-year-old child standing silent on the morning his mother left to a 57-year-old man learning to stand alone once again, there is one undeniable truth. He never truly got over that pain. He just learned how to carry it. Some stories are told as journeys of triumph over adversity, where the protagonist faces trauma, overcomes it, and emerges stronger. But Hugh's story isn't like that. He didn't defeat the fear of abandonment. He didn't erase the wounds from his past. Those things are still there, still part of how he sees the world, how he loves, how he tries to keep everything from falling apart. But what makes him who he is isn't that he no longer hurts. It's that he still keeps living, even when the pain remains. Throughout his life, Hugh built a legacy that isn't just in the movies, the awards, or the rounds of applause. It's a legacy of perseverance, a person who kept moving forward even when filled with cracks inside. Of kindness, the way he treated others, the way he kept warmth in a world that can make people cold, and above all, the ability to get back up. Not once, but many times, every time life pulled him back to places he thought he had left behind. Hugh Jackman isn't a perfect hero. He isn't someone always strong, always in control, always with answers to every problem. And perhaps that's exactly what makes his story more relatable, more real. Because he's like so many people, carrying unseen wounds, trying to live a better life, and sometimes failing to keep everything intact. But he didn't give up, even in moments when he lost his way, even in times when he had to face the very fear he had carried since he was a child. He kept going, not because he no longer hurt, but because he chose not to let that pain define his entire being. He didn't need to be perfect to keep living. He just needed to keep going. And perhaps that's the most memorable thing. Not the roles, not the achievements, but a person who went through so much, who lost, who doubted, who hurt, but still didn't stop. Not because he was stronger than the pain, but because he learned how to walk with it. In this world, we often look for stories with neat endings where everything is fixed, every wound healed, every question answered. But real life isn't always like that. And Hugh Jackman's story reminds us of a simple but profound truth, that sometimes victory isn't about no longer hurting, but about still continuing to live, to love, to keep walking, even when the pain is still there and somewhere. In the silence after everything, with no lights, no roles, just one person standing with himself. Not perfect, not complete, but still enough to continue. A person who doesn't need to become a legend to have meaning. A person who just needs to not give up. Some wounds never heal, but somehow he chose to keep living anyway. The story of Hugh Jackman doesn't just inspire admiration. It leaves a deep, aching sadness, because behind the image of Hollywood's perfect man is the journey of a child who was never truly healed. That morning, when he was 8 years old, and his mother left without any explanation, wasn't just a memory. It was the cut that shaped his entire life, creating a fear of abandonment that lasted all the way into adulthood, and faced him again with the divorce after 27 years together. The most heartbreaking thing isn't that he failed. It's that he tried so hard to become perfect, to be the good kid, the ideal man, the flawless star, just to hold on to love he was always afraid would slip away. Even at the peak with Wolverine, Broadway, and prestigious awards, inside he was still a man carrying an emptiness that the spotlight could never fill. The recurring skin cancer, the body worn down by the role, the loneliness after the stage lights went out, all of it reveals a very human truth. Success cannot replace healing. But what makes this story so valuable to Americans, a society that prizes personal resilience, is that he didn't give up. He didn't conquer the pain, but he chose to live with it, chose to keep being a father, chose to keep loving, and gradually chose to accept his own imperfection. The lesson here isn't about becoming stronger than every hardship. It's about learning to be honest with yourself, daring to face the hurt, and understanding that a person's worth doesn't lie in never falling, but in still getting back up, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep listening to the real journeys behind the spotlight. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where another story will make you look at life in a deeper way.